welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager, and our co-host is curator Dr. Ollie Douglas. So we took not one, but two unexpected breaks. Firstly, I had flu, and then when we planned to share the new episode on Thursday, we accidentally re-uploaded the first conversation with Guy instead. It was an amazing chat, so we're glad people caught it, but it was not the plan. Thank you especially to the Blue Sky user who said that it was very interesting, but didn't seem to match the pheasant-related title at all. You weren't wrong. Anyway, it's a delight to be sharing this second episode today, the correct one, with the brilliant author and environmentalist Guy Shrubsole, whose name has been a mainstay in our podcast episodes in the last year because of his central role in the Right to Roam movement, fighting for access to England's green space. Last time, we discussed the potted history of who owns England, starting with the Normans and going right up to the present day, and how landowners use land and restrict access. This time, though, we're focusing on one specific aspect of land use, in the form of hunting and, more specifically, grouse shooting. Hunting has been a part of rural society for as long as humans have needed food to survive, yet its modern manifestation in the countryside is significantly different to tradition. And that has major implications on the natural world. As you might expect, this episode contains some quite strong references to animal cruelty, so listener discretion is advised. Enjoy. Welcome back, Guy. Great to have you back on the podcast.
Lovely to be back again after such a long time away.
It's been a very long time, hasn't it? Many moons have passed. We've eaten some fruit. That was nice, Ollie.
Yeah, the fruit was good. Yeah. Tasty fruit.
Just had some blueberries that Ollie brought in for his lunch.
Yeah, they were not blueberries from the Scottish border, sadly.
Yeah.
So they weren't gathered then?
No, sadly not.
But we are talking about hunting today.
We are talking about hunting.
We are going to talk about hunting.
Hunting, not gathering.
What an amazing segue.
Yeah. You should be doing this podcast, Guy.
Yeah,
you're a
Come
professional.
On over. Yeah. Last episode, we talked about who owns England. So we delved into basically 1,000 years of history, starting with the Normans through to Henry VIII and the Victorians. And hunting came up. But this episode, we're going to dive much more into the history of hunting, as a tradition, and I guess as part of the countryside and to what extent it really is part of rural tradition, I suppose.
And I think we're going to focus a little bit more on game shooting than other forms of hunting, but perhaps we could start with a slightly more general sense of where hunting fits in the history of rural England. Guy, do you think you could give us a kind of potted sense of where that fits? Not necessarily 1,000 years of history in quite the same depth and detail that we asked you to last time, but hunting, an overview.
It doesn't have to be potted, by the way. Yeah. You can give a non-potted answer if you want.
A brief explainer.
Yeah.
So I think one way into the history of hunting in Britain is clearly through the lens of the crown and what royalty have done down through the centuries, because very often they've had a huge outsized impact on wider customs practiced by landowners, by the aristocracy, and by society at large. And I guess I would go back to something we very briefly touched on in the last podcast, which was royal forests, which were these hunting grounds essentially established by the Norman kings, in which royalty and court favourites were allowed to go hunting deer and so on, wild boar, when we still had wild boar in this country, but other people were excluded from doing so. In fact, it was, a very, very great crime to go hunting and poaching the royal game in these sort of enclosures, in these places like the New Forest, places like the Forest of Dartmoor, places like the Forest of Exmoor. And from my perspective, there is something that for a long period of time, I actually think hunting traditions in this country were, relatively sustainable. They were practices whereby the gamekeepers, the owners of the game, the crown and so on, were essentially seeking to conserve game. They were conserving populations of deer or of wild boar in order to hunt them. They were conserving the habitats in which these species of wildlife existed. So we do have William the Conqueror to thank for one thing, I think, which is the preservation of the New Forest, which is, by the views of many ecologists, one of the most amazing ancient woodlands in Western Europe, because it has so many ancient trees that have survived in it, so many areas of not only woodland but also heathland that date back a long way as well. And this area has been preserved as a largely intact ecosystem, obviously subject to human influences and pressures. But it's perhaps an example of a time when hunting was clearly extremely unequal, but actually arguably more sustainable than some of the more modern incarnations of hunting and shooting. But to really kind of spool forward a long way very quickly, I think that really started to change in the 19th century, when you had some very different forms of game hunting, game shooting, starting to come into fashion. And again, the royalty, the crown, the monarch, was heavily involved in promulgating these new fashions and fads. One of which was the fashion for driven grouse shooting, which really went on to transform the uplands of Britain. To explain what grouse shooting is, the red grouse is a native species to Britain. It exists in upland, moorland areas where it feasts on heather. And what people going grouse shooting obviously end up doing is traditionally they would just simply walk up into the hills and go and shoot some grouse. What driven grouse shooting is a much more recent invention and innovation, whereby you essentially transform the landscape in order to maximize the number of red grouse to be able to shoot. The driven aspect of it refers to the fact that grouse shoots will employ a set of people known as beaters, who will go out and essentially drive the grouse out of the heather, flushing them out so that they can be shot more readily by the guns, the people standing in the shooting butts where they shoot their guns from. And the reason why I think this is a kind of real departure is because what happened in the 1850s was that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert bought Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. It was already supported red grouse in the hills around there, but what they decided to do was create a driven grouse shoot there. It's something that some other aristocrats had practiced previously, but what Victoria and Albert really did was to popularise it. And they popularised it in a way that royalty, popularised everything at this time, where, suddenly everybody who was anybody had to get a grouse moor. They had to adopt this royal fashion for shooting as many birds as possible. And you sort of got into these really quite grotesque shooting competitions as to who could shoot the most red grouse in a single day. I think it reached its complete apotheosis in 1915, when there was a shoot that took place on the Aberstead estate, which is in the Forest of Bowland, today owned by the Duke of Westminster. I think it was owned by somebody else at the time. And the grisly record for the most number of birds, of red grouse shot on a single day, was set on the 12th of August of 1915, and it was a staggering 2,929 birds which were shot in that single day's shooting.
Horrendous.
Yeah, kind of horrendous, and sort of interesting to sort of note that date of 1915 as the First World War was in full swing, and
people are breaking the records for massacring grouse. Yeah,
exactly.
I'm struck by what you said that back in its medieval root, a lot of this was about conserving the population of these animals. When you've got a huge excess number of animals, perhaps hunting has a function for controlling the population. But here, it's the complete opposite. It's letting the population completely go wild and then just exterminating huge numbers. Like the actual utility of it has completely gone, and it is just pure sport at this point.
So I think that's crucial, really. I think, Jay. Yes, I think what we're talking about here is what really made driven grouse shooting different to what happened before was, previously you were trying to conserve a habitat and conserving the wildlife that came in it so that you could take some of them as game, as shoot them and eat them. What you're doing with a driven grouse moor is you're manipulating the ecosystem in a much, much more interventionist way. What happens on a grouse moor is that you set fire to it each year. Landowners will set fire to it through practice of rotational burning. This will kind of cover it in this kind of checkerboard pattern of burned areas and not burned areas. The point of that is to bring forward fresh shoots of heather, which is what the young red grouse like to eat. That's going to boost their numbers. What you also do if you're a gamekeeper on a grouse moor is ultimately you are trying to reduce all of the predator numbers, the natural predators on that grouse moor, so that you preserve as many of the red grouse as possible and boost their numbers that way. If you go up onto a grouse moor, you'll end up finding loads and loads of traps everywhere, whether that's, bait traps or whatever, or, things that have been set in order to catch ferrets and stoats and weasels and foxes. And also you'll get illegal raptor persecution going on grouse moors. This is something that has been recorded many, many times by wildlife crime investigators, by groups like the RSPB, where you have birds of prey that obviously themselves, as the name suggests, will predate on other birds like red grouse, being shot illegally by gamekeepers in order to reduce their predation effects and to boost the numbers of red grouse. So you have all of these ways in which kind of people are manipulating the environment to boost the numbers of birds to shoot.
And the brutality of it is so staggering as well. I mean, I hadn't heard of rotational burning before. I mean, how are they doing that? Like, how are they actually going?
It literally just means setting the moor on fire. And obviously it's done in a way that is meant to be controlled, and so that it doesn't get out of control. It does sometimes, of course, get out of control. Sometimes fire brigades do have to be called. It's fortunate that in recent years, after a lot of campaigning, there have been more restrictions placed on rotational burning on moorland. More regulations have come in that mean it can only be done in much more limited circumstances now. But for decades, over a century and a half, this was being done on a very, very large scale. And the other crucial thing we have to recognise about moorlands is that they overlie a huge amount of peat. And peat is an enormous and incredibly important natural carbon store in Britain. We have a huge area of peatland in this country. And it's really something that we should be keeping intact and keeping it wet and healthy and so on, preserving the mosses and blanket bog that normally and naturally exist there. But over the last century and a half, as a result of Victoria and Albert's fad for driven grouse shooting, essentially the landowners, and there it is, as you might expect, a small number of very wealthy landowners who can afford to own these huge several thousand acre grouse moors, they have essentially set on fire our largest carbon store. So it's these big impacts on the climate crisis as well.
Because we've talked a few times on the podcast about sheep-wrecked landscapes and the environmental impact of farming, but here it almost seems it's entirely for sport, and the level of destruction is just almost apocalyptic if you're literally setting the moors on fire. And the fact that it's happening around the time, literally at the same time in this case as World War I, also feels really significant. So much of what we have at the museum is about, and indeed the reason for Merle coming into existence was about the changes in farming technology that resulted as part of World War II. So seeing this the sort of seeds of this in the First World War 30 years before is, interesting. The zenith of that transformation,
And in terms of those sheep-wrecked landscapes, it's the sort of giving over of some of those landscapes to sheep that enables a lot of the grouse moors to become established as grouse moors. They wouldn't have been quite the same kind of landscapes prior to that. They're sort of grazed down by the sheep, and the sheep in turn are there because of highland and lowland clearances. So there's a history of enclosure going on here that underpins all of this. So it relates very strongly back to some of the conversations we were having last episode. These are quite familiar things to me because, as I explained last time, and as I've said before, I grew up in the Scottish borders, and my parents rented a hill farm from the Duke of Roxburgh, and that's a hill farm that these practices were certainly carried out then and would still be now. It's a shooting landscape really, as well as a sheep farming landscape. So it's a kind of familiar thing to me. So it's quite surprising to me to see the shock that you're experiencing, Joe. Learning about these things for the first time.
Well, I knew about hunting when I was a kid because I mean, funnily, you talked about the fens and the draining of the fens in the last episode, and I'm from the East Midlands, so I'm kind of familiar with some of this. But I grew up quite rurally and would see hunts, especially around like the holidays, like Christmas. I'd often see like hunts going out, and you'd hear people shooting and stuff like that. But I just wasn't aware of the level of the actual destruction that goes alongside it, other than the animals, of course.
I mean, I think for me, I'm not opposed to shooting per se. I think that it has, traditional forms of hunting that have been practiced in this country for centuries, millennia, are justifiable in my mind. But for me, the thing that I find quite objectionable, and is one of the reasons why I've written about this and campaigned against it, is the kind of modern industrialized form of shooting that I think has emerged in Britain since the Victorian period, and in some cases has really only started in very recent decades. And it's very interesting. I totally understand this, and how you're sort of less familiar with this show, because obviously for most people living in England, in Britain, we don't necessarily get to see the uplands that much. And perhaps when we go for a walk in the uplands, we might see some nice purple flowering heather and think, oh, that's quite nice. But that sort of whole system of both of land ownership, the huge estates that govern these areas, that own these areas, and also that kind of system of shooting that underpins it, I think is perhaps more mysterious to more of us. But something I think that perhaps more of your listeners and more people will be aware of is another form of shooting that's taken off enormously in this country just in the last 40 or 50 years, and that's pheasant shooting. So this happens more in the lowlands of Britain, and particularly in England. Whereas, in contrast to grouse shooting, which is, exclusively done in the upland moorland areas of England and Scotland, you're almost guaranteed to know what a pheasant looks like. You've seen a pheasant often represented as an emblem of the British countryside, no less, despite the fact that it is in fact a non-native species to Britain. In fact, I saw a recent front cover of a book called England: A Natural History, in which, won't name the author, John Lewis Stemple.
We'll drop the ISBN number.
In which, proudly there strutting on the front cover was a pheasant. And I was like, how is that part of the natural history of England? Obviously, it is part of the history of England because we have had pheasants in this country, some say since the Roman period. But what we haven't had strutting around England since the Roman period is 50 million pheasants, because that is the number that is currently introduced by landowners each year into the British countryside. 50 million pheasants.
Each year.
50 million pheasants each year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is, to put that in some context, that is the same weight of biomass as all of the wild birds in Britain put together.
Wow.
So that is an enormous, uncontrolled experiment that a relatively small number of estates are acting on the British countryside.
50 million is an absolutely colossal figure.
Yeah.
It really is. And the scariest thing as well is how recently this has happened. So in my book, The Lie of the Land, which actually literally has a dead pheasant on the front cover of the paperback edition of it, because it features, pheasant shooting features as a chapter in it. I talk about Danny the Champion of the World, Roald Dahl's famous book, which for many people is the sort of start and end point of being familiar with pheasant shooting. And I talk about how when Danny the Champion of the World was written in the 1970s, really the kind of industrialization of pheasant shooting hadn't actually got going at that time. Roald Dahl was talking about kind of a sort of, as he would sort of term it, a sort of slightly nouveau riche shoot that was taking place on the outskirts of, actually inspired by a place near to where Dahl was living in the Chilterns. And he wrote about Danny going and poaching these pheasants with his father. But what's happened since Danny the Champion of the World was written is really quite extraordinary. There's been a tenfold increase in the number of pheasants released into the British countryside, even since that book was published. And so you sort of get a sense of the sheer scale of this industry nowadays. And then you start having to ask, what is that doing to the rest of the wildlife that is in the countryside? What's that doing to ancient woodlands? What's that doing to levels of pollution from pheasant release pens in which loads of pheasants are eating and shitting and so on? And what's that doing to other species that pheasants predate? Everything from, insects and earthworms all the way up to adders, which are a species that are on the brink of extinction in Britain, but which pheasants see as a threat, and so will peck to death if they see one.
There's an interesting contrast here, I think, between the way in which, even at the beginning of this episode, we were sort of stringing together and piecing together all these many different related factors and causes that transform rural landscapes, thinking about land ownership, thinking about hunting, thinking about the links between them and nobility and all of that, versus this completely unscientific risk of just releasing 50 million pheasants every year. I mean, it's just, I don't think I can get past it.
And it has an extraordinary impact on landscapes. But it's also something that sort of sits uncomfortably with me in relation to the experiences of shooting that I grew up with. So growing up on a farm, my father ran a shoot, but that was a shoot for him and neighbouring farmers and local people. It was a different kind of shoot altogether. It wasn't a commercial shoot. He wasn't making income from that. It was just a sort of a social experience, but also something that resulted in everyone taking home a brace of pheasants or whatever was bagged on the day, and that's a very different thing. So this feels to me like the upscaling, the intensification, the market capitalization of shooting. It's a different thing entirely, and it leads me to also ask the question: who are the people doing the shooting? It's a little bit like who owns England. Are these people the people of the country, the countrymen and countrywomen who, traditionally might have been engaging in these sports, or are they actually people coming from elsewhere? It's a kind of slight tension. The defense of this is often around, again, forms of countryside stewardship, forms of traditional practice in the countryside. And that sits uncomfortably for me with something that's really about people coming in as a sort of form of pursuit. It's theme parks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sense that it's, that it's a time-honoured English tradition or British tradition is clearly not true. It's not borne out by the facts in terms of the scale of it, as we've been saying. I think, so one of the things that I found most appalling about the scale of pheasant shooting these days was actually through going on a trespass. We talked in the previous episode about Right to Roam, which I helped co-found. And one of the early trespasses that we organised was into a woodland that was being used as a pheasant shoot and it's on land owned by the Duke of Somerset on the outskirts of Totnes, near where I live. And, we went through a couple of hundred people came on this mass trespass. We made sure that we kept a forestry track, so we weren't trying to disturb any ground nesting birds or leave any litter. We, in fact, picked up quite a lot of empty plastic shotgun cartridges that we found on our way through the pheasant shoot. We saw plenty of signs of, chicken wire mesh enclosures for the pheasants in the wood, saw how much the woodland floor had been scraped around and kind of disturbed by the pheasants as they ran around in their pens, in their release pens. And then we got to a field on the outskirts of the woods, had a sit down, had a picnic, talked about what we'd been seeing. Someone went for a call of nature behind a hedge and came back looking pretty shocked and ashen-faced. And when we went to see what they had found, it was this vast pit, probably an old quarry that was now being used as a kind of dumping ground, a place where lots of rubbish had been dumped. But on top of this pile of kind of old discarded fencing and old washing machines and things like that were very clearly the bodies of dozens and dozens of pheasants. And they'd just been thrown into this pit, presumably not eaten, presumably killed at the end of the shooting season and discarded. And, this was not a one-off occurrence. This is something that there's plenty of investigations that have been done by journalists and animal welfare campaigners and so on that have filmed these sorts of instances and uncovered these sorts of practices, which goes completely against the kind of codes of good shooting practice that are put out by some of the shooting organisations like BASC and so on, GWCT, but clearly does happen on quite a large scale in the countryside. And that is a function of releasing quite so many millions and tens of millions of birds. And you sort of asked, Ollie, about sort of who goes shooting. Well, I have no doubt that it is something that, people from various walks of life do. I'm not saying this is a purely, absolute elite sport. Although grouse shooting, I think, is very elite. And is absolutely, I think, in fact, even The Spectator once called it screamingly elitist to be able to own a grouse.
It's pretty expensive.
Yeah.
It's pretty damn expensive.
Yeah.
And it is, the thing is that some of the best pheasant shoots are, though, also very expensive. Particularly in places like Exmoor, where you've had a real explosion in the number of shoots over the last 20 or 25 years, to the extent that even the National Park Authority there are getting quite concerned about the scale of this industry and the impact it's having on what is meant to be a national park, after all, for everyone. And in places like that, where you have this sort of the phenomenon of like high birds, because you've got all the coombs, the deep-sided coombs in Exmoor, so it makes it a more interesting shoot, apparently, because you're having to shoot high over your head. And that can get, pull in quite a lot of money. It's becoming a big commercial business for people. And that's where you get business away days, city boys going for a weekend shooting, coming into the countryside and doing that at a weekend. It's not really the sorts of thing that you were talking about, Ollie, that took place on your dad's farm.
Yeah, and I have a slight experience of that, because as a child, I was a beater in those shoots. I'd be given a fiver, probably not a fiver. It was probably less than that. It was a long time ago. Given a little bit of money for a day's effort, charging around, chasing up birds. For farmers who were largely very bad shots, so not a lot of pheasants or anything else getting shot, and then everyone would sit down for a meal in the evening. That was a very different experience to another experience I had of beating years later, when as an adult, an old friend of mine invited me to go on a shoot. And this was somewhere near Lewes in Sussex. And I agreed to go. I've never been a shooter, so I agreed to go and sort of be a beater for a day, out in the countryside. And it was a very different experience, because the people shooting were all sort of guns coming from very different environments. There were people who were buying a day's shooting. And it felt very dangerous. It felt scary, because they were shooting low over the heads of the beaters, and it just felt very, very different and far removed from that childhood experience. And again, lots more birds being shot, and I very much suspect not that many of them being taken home. It was a kind of, I feel slightly ashamed for being part of that in a way, but it's an industry that has changed staggeringly over the course of my lifetime and my connection with the countryside, and it sort of needs to be put in check. And as a sort of aside to that, and it references some of the things you've been talking about, Guy, I was just reflecting when we were planning for this episode on the collections of the museum, and we don't really have that much in the collections that represent that much more recent shift in the intensification of shooting and the sort of commercial upscaling of it. Most of the stuff we have speaks to earlier phases in these processes and histories. So we have raptor traps, very illegal. Couldn't use them out there in the countryside, thankfully. So they speak to particular ways of changing in a positive way and legislating in a positive way around practices related to rural pursuits like this. We don't really have that much that represents this more recent history. We have one or two examples of shotguns, I think, but they're actually quite outmoded. And most of the earlier guns that we hold in the collections, you wouldn't be able to fire anyway. They're sort of flintlock, muzzle loading. You'd have a powder flask and a completely different technology. So it's partly that shift of technology in the mid 19th century, as you said, to the breech loading shotgun. We don't really reflect that. So we haven't brought that story up to date. And I guess partly that's to do with the fact that there is a degree of sort of heirloom to some of these guns. They're quite valuable early breech loader shotguns, quite collectible. They're not necessarily the kind of things that people give to museums. They're the kind of things that they hand on to their children or they sell in the antiques market. We don't actually have an enormous amount of that kind of pheasant tat, that connects to this mythology of pheasants as a part of the natural landscape of England. Which, I'm feeling like we ought to be out there collecting pheasant tat, getting a head around this stuff. Hopefully, before there are shifts in legislation and it ceases to be a major part of country life.
I should mention also that the phrase pheasant tat is one used by Ruth Tingay, who is a fantastic campaigner with Wild Justice, who've done possibly the most of any environmental campaign is to try and draw attention to the scale of pheasant shooting these days, and also the environmental impacts it is having on, sites of special scientific interest. And Ruth Tenge sort of, I think, posts on Blue Sky from every now and then her favourite example of pheasant tat, and whether it's sort of pheasants on jigsaw puzzles or pheasants on the front cover of nature books or whatever. So yes, maybe there's some inspiration there for future collections for Merle.
Going to back, you mentioned about like company retreats, going on hunting trips and things like that. We chatted in an earlier episode with Amy Bateman, the photographer who made 40 Farms, which we had at the Merle last year. Amazing collection of photos of farming life in the Lake District, and a lot of her work is about how the reality of the countryside today and the difficulties and the challenges that farmers face. And it made me reflect, really, just as you were saying that there is this view of hunting as this like rustic, rural tradition, but actually how hunting manifests today is just so dramatically different. It's the sort of level of like aggression and technology is so different to anything that we've experienced in the past, really.
I think that's true, and I think that actually some of the most forward-thinking people in the sort of shooting industry also understand that, and they're starting to see that, and actually they know in their hearts that if things continue as they have done in recent decades, then the industry is heading for greater regulation and possibly more stringent constraints on what it can do. And actually, some of the more interesting thinking on this, I think, is being done around people who perhaps are interested in the rewilding of estates, the rewilding of upland estates, the rewilding of land. They're looking to other European countries where there are different traditions of shooting. They're looking to places like Norway, where there is, a kind of tradition of mountain hunting, where, you're hunting in a much more wilder landscape, where it's not sort of a kind of monoculture of heather. It's actually a much kind of more varied mosaic of different habitats of bogs and birch forests in the uplands and scrub and so on as well. And you probably have to have slightly more skill to be able to go hunting in those conditions. And you might be shunting different species. We might actually end up reintroducing certain species that are missing from Britain these days because of previous, either overhunting or the destruction of habitats. I mean, one of the species that I mentioned earlier that has, of course, largely disappeared from these shores is that was hunted very much in the Middle Ages was wild boar. And wild boar are, of course, making a comeback in places like the Forest of Dean, but have yet to be sort of introduced on a more widespread basis. I'd also draw an interesting kind of contrast between the bureaucracy that surrounds the reintroduction of formerly native species to this country, like beavers, for example, and the huge amounts of paperwork that farmers, landowners, people like Derek Gow, one of the big proponents of beaver reintroductions, have to go through in order to reintroduce what is actually a native species, and the almost complete lack of regulation to introduce 50 million
pheasants, to
this country every year and to go out and shoot some of them. So I think there really is a massive kind of irony there, and something that does need correction. And again, I am actually, to try and not sound utterly gloomy about all these topics, I am actually quite optimistic about this because, again, we in the previous podcast we did mention the government's new land use framework for England that it brought out recently, and amongst various measures in it, it does talk about the need for greater regulation of some of these shoots. It talks about exploring measures like licensing, which would mean that in future game bird shooting has to be subject to a license, perhaps with more stringent criteria. We don't know yet what the government is going to consult on, but perhaps with more stringent criteria about the numbers that are released. And that's something I would very much welcome. And I think actually those who enjoy going shooting, but perhaps have a more traditional view of what shooting should be about, probably ought to be welcoming those measures and seeing it as the kind of the long overdue check that the modern industrialized form of this industry has been needing for quite some time.
I'm struck by you referencing beavers because in one of our most recent episodes of the podcast, the local nature guardian, an immense character, Adrian Lawson, was talking about the Fobney Martians. So these are local nature guardians who care for and have taken upon themselves to look after a tract of what might previously have been described as kind of waste or scrappy land just here within Reading, and caring for it for nature recovery. And Adrian's getting increasingly excited about the proximity of beavers to Fobney Marsh, and keeps messaging around the Fobney Martians chat about various beaver sightings not that far away. So the immense excitement of those kind of nature recovery projects and processes, and the fact that they can galvanise such immense support, I think that the Martians are numbering somewhere in the region of 193 at the moment, and heading upwards, hopefully, because I mentioned them on BBC Radio Berkshire this morning as well. The more we give a shout out to these organisations, the more they gather momentum. It strikes me that there is an appetite out there for a different kind of relationship that can bring as much enthusiasm and connectivity to the countryside as some of these somewhat invented or rather skewed traditions that we think of as being the things that are deserving of a place in the Museum of English Rural Life and the stories that we tell. Are there other good examples of that, Guy, that you can think of that are, different ways of using these landscapes that and different ways of thinking about these landscapes that are, might galvanize that kind of support and interest and perhaps even income? Because that, of course, is a major factor in how and why shoots come about in the first place.
Well, I mean, I think it's, I would just say that traditional rural relationships with nature don't have to just be mediated through shooting something. And there are obviously lots of traditions of people relating to the countryside, to the rest of the living world around us in other ways. You can look to the experiences of and the writings of people like John Clare, and looking at how intensely invested this amazing 18th and early 19th century poet was in the landscape that he grew up in and lived in, and how he found huge meaning through going and searching for everything from nightingales to glowworms and everything that existed in his neck of the woods. In terms of modern uses of the land, modern traditions that are being created, I mean, I'm really interested in the modern folk revival. You obviously explore in Radical Rural and in many of your recent podcasts.
With our friend Old Crocken.
Old Crocken, yeah.
And Old Crocken, the kind of the rediscovery of spirits of place. I went to a wonderful May Day celebration last year at the Cerne Giant in Dorset, where not only did the Wessex Morris side dance as the sun rose, but also the Dorset Oozer made an appearance. I'm not saying these are traditions.
Who is the Dorset Oozer?
The Dorset Oozer is a wonderful. The first and only real record of it, I think, is a kind of 19th century photograph, grainy Victorian photograph we have of this incredible, weird carved mask, a very fearsome looking monster with horns and sort of shaggy pelt of hair and a mouth that kind of clacked open. And the whereabouts of that original mask have been lost to dust and history. But more recently, it's been sort of revived and recarved. And I don't actually know. Do you have an Oozer in your collections? I think I've seen one in the Dorchester Museum is where I've seen one most recently.
Yeah, no, we have a hobby horse.
Yes.
It's actually a London-based Morris side, the Whirligigs, Wimbledon Whirligigs, our hobby horse. So it's not even really that rural, but we're lacking an Oozer. So if anyone out there has an Oozer
and masks, I think we chatted with.
There aren't that many sort of mask traditions where the original or early examples survive, and I think. When we were chatting to Ruth and Lisa about Old Crockern, so that's previous episodes about the lost giants. The sort of story was that there's really only one surviving giant in collections.
Yeah.
But I think that idea of revival sort of the reimagination of these traditions as part of a different kind of relationship with landscapes is really absolutely critical.
I find it very comforting, actually. Yeah. I mean, I think Ruth and Lisa described amazingly the experience of seeing old Crocken up on Dartmoor. And even having Crocken in the galleries, it's the same experience. There is just something just very consoling about these giants.
Yeah, it's magical.
In such like strange and precarious and technologized times, just having a giant in your presence is really quite comforting.
And there's something really lovely about living traditions. So this brings us neatly to intangible cultural heritage. I think your fellow Right to Roamer, Nick Hayes, when I said I was going to put some of his work in the current gallery trail, he said, "Oh, that's it. We're done for. You've kind of consigned us to history. You know, that's the end of us." But that's not really what heritage is about. Heritage is about taking these things and reimagining them and making use of them to galvanize new conversations. And intangible cultural heritage is the sort of counterpoint to what happens in museums and archives and libraries. It's not about gathering together things and that have fallen out of use, or gathering together examples of things that are still used out there in the world and sort of killing them, taking them out of use. It's more about celebrating sort of live and active and ongoing ways of engaging with the past in the present. And so I guess the Lost Giants are an example of that. Heritage crafts are an example of that. And very recently, 2024, the UK became signatories to the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. So we now have a living heritage portal managed by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It's worth checking out that website, and we'll put it in the show notes. But it's an opportunity for people to come forward and communities to express their commitment to particular kinds of heritage, rural and otherwise. So it's not just specific to rural heritage. There is, however, a tension running through that. And I think it brings us back to hunting and to shooting, and particular hunting lobbies and shooting lobbies, who I think will be putting pressure on the Living Heritage Portal to list and sort of record certain forms of tradition around hunting and shooting practices. So I think coming back to some of the things you've been saying, Guy, about, you know, there was a time when some of these practices weren't as intensive, that perhaps they were part of more managed and sustainable and perhaps local traditions. Maybe we want to see a process whereby the listing and recognition of them as heritage is more a listing of those processes where they are managed in a sustainable way, rather than listing of mass shoots and grouse-driven shooting. And
this reminds me of when we were talking about Old Crocken, Lisa Schneidau said that she really worried what would have happened if Alexander Darwall had appropriated Crocken. You know, if Crocken had been weaponized by the other side rather than just the people fighting for access. And I guess it's true of all these things, that there's a risk that, you know, tradition can be co-opted in the same way. You know, it's
Absolutely, and I think it's certainly one of the weapons, as it were, wielded by the modern shooting lobby, which is to try and again to entrench and claim that what they're doing is merely traditional. I'd just add one other thing, because you sort of asked earlier, Ollie, about sort of modern traditions that could also be ways of creating income. And you know, I'm not suggesting that everybody going Morris dancing and getting up early on May Day is necessarily going to earn anybody much income. But something that I do think there is clearly potential for new businesses, rural businesses in the future is more around wildlife safaris. In fact, you know, at the Knepp Estate, you know, one of the obviously forefront of the rewilding movement in this country, you know, they literally call their rewilding trips and guided tours wildlife safaris. So there's that kind of hint there of that link to both the aristocratic past of safari parks that previous generations of aristocrats have tried to implement in the UK as a kind of way of making money. But also I think there's an interesting hint there of something that in the past would have been about safaris to go and hunt big game. But actually, surely it's far more sustainable and far more meaningful to go and experience wildlife as a living ecosystem, and to go, as I have done, to Nep to go on a wildlife safari to see the purple emperor butterfly flying around the wonderful majestic oak trees that they have on the Nep estate is something that I'll always remember. Something also that I think falls into this category is something I'm going to later this week is the wonderful modern tradition of singing with nightingales, which is something that is hosted by Sam Lee, the wonderful folk singer, and he leads groups of people who pay to go on these expeditions out into an area of remote scrubland in Sussex, where nightingales gather and sing at night, and he sings in harmony with them, and echoing that relationship that John Clare had with the nightingale and its out-sobbing song that he recorded several hundred years ago. To me, that is just as meaningful, and in many ways far more meaningful than going into the countryside and shooting some pheasants that we've released there.
Yeah, 50 million pheasants. Yeah. What a beautiful experience. That I hope you have a wonderful time.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
I just want to ask very briefly about that, Guy, because that again brings us back, I guess, to who has permission to access these spaces, who's allowed to be in these spaces, and again, that's quite a privileged form of access. How do we open up and make those kind of experiences accessible to a larger number of people? And obviously that brings us back to last episode, and who's allowed to go places and where and how they're allowed to go there, and responsible access.
Absolutely. Well, two very simple things, I think, for something like nightingales. I mean, nightingales are if not yet on the brink of extinction, they are certainly dwindling enormously in England. One thing that we need to do is to simply restore more habitat in which species like nightingales can exist. And instead of kind of denigrating scrub as a habitat that we want to get rid of in our sort of slightly tidy-minded view of the modern countryside, we should be encouraging it. We should be encouraging blackthorn and hawthorn stands of scrub to exist and to thrive, because these are nightingale habitats. And secondly, of course, is we need a greater right of legal access to these places, to be able to go into the countryside and not be hemmed in by the fences and the keep out signs that have often been erected around scrub and woodland in order to keep people out of pheasant shoots, but instead allow people in to responsibly access the countryside in order to enjoy the wildlife that hopefully we get to see recovering in the future.
So I think you referred to on the back of Nicola Chester's latest book, there's a little quote from you referring to Nicola as the John Clare of our time, Guy. And I wonder whether we can give you the Gilbert White of our time or some other similar kind of nature epithet. You're doing extraordinary work here.
Highly undeserving of that, Ollie, but that's very nice of you. Thank you.
I think as we draw this to a close, I mean, just thank you so much, Guy, for your time, because it's been absolutely wonderful chatting with you. And
I feel like we're going to have to lure you back with a lark spinner from the collection or something. Yeah. Not that we're into shooting lark, but but it does nice shiny things that you can come and look at in the collection, and we can talk to you about.
But being serious, I feel like with the radical rural displays and all of the people we've spoken to as part of this kind of mini series of the podcast, it's amazing talking about things that are happening right now. I think when the podcast began, we were much more in the sort of medieval history and Victorians, and we've rapidly gone closer and closer, right into the present. So,
but I think if talking to Guy teaches us anything, it teaches us that the medieval and all of those earlier periods are living out in different ways in the present, and we're living with the legacies of those as well. That complex palimpsest of the landscapes of England. Yeah. We've got a lot to unpick, Joe.
Yes.
Early days.
Yeah, early days. It continues. Well, thank you so much, Guy.
Thank you.
That's brilliant.
Fantastic talking to you. And looking forward to my next trip to Merle and for the radical rural meeting up.
Enjoy the nightingales.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Absolute Units. I've been Joe Vaughan, and our co-host has been Dr. Ollie Douglas. Absolute Units is made possible by Museums Partnership Reading, our Arts Council funded partnership of the Merle and Reading Museum. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode. And yeah, if you're enjoying, please leave us a review. It really does mean the world to us and helps us reach new listeners. If you've got any questions, we have hopefully enabled a fan mail option via the show notes. So do check that out and send it in. We'll see you next time.